My videos tend to be fact-based, that is not really opinion, but one thing I do for patrons every month is I go over some of the videos which I've done, and sometimes I put in my opinion about the cars and the videos that I've done. And I thought, particularly with the Beetle one here, I thought it might be an idea to maybe give you a bit of an extra bit of video to talk really about some of the background stuff and maybe even some of my opinions on what was going on at the time. So here goes. This is all off the cuff. This isn't scripted, and so you can see there's going to be a lot of jump cuts and ums and ers and things, because that's why I have a script, because I'm not very good at this sort of thing. So anyway, off the cuff, here we go. So many thought the Beetle, even in the 1940s, 1945 when it was first produced, it was already out of date. They thought the style was old-fashioned, it was a 1930s style, and so people were saying, well, it's not really going to work. So we talk about the Beetle being replaced in the 1970s, but even in the 1940s, people were thinking they shouldn't even have started making it in the first place. But of course, the style became a classic, and I suppose this happens to a lot of cars like the Mini and cars like that, that eventually, because they're not updated, eventually they become classic, I suppose. Even by the 1950s, it was seen as classic, unique, individual. And you can see that with the 1950s update, the first one they tried to do, which was a sort of reaction to the initial styling, trying to make it still look sort of like a Beetle, but as time went on, they realized that the Beetle style wasn't really going to work, and they needed to have something that was a lot more practical, because the Beetle shape, although it was cute and eventually it started looking very, very cute, if you've been in one, you sort of right up here with the windscreen, it's not a very good ergonomic design. And this is a problem they had with the 1990s car. Actually, I think a job they did very well with the 1990s Beetle when they remade it was they managed to keep something very close to the original shape and style, but it was pretty practical. It was fairly practical. They managed to get the engine up front, and they managed to give it a decent sized boot, and you could get 4 people in comfort, certainly a lot more comfort than the original car. So another thing to look at is you look at Volkswagen, and you look at Volkswagen today and you think, well, why didn't they just remake the car? Because you think of them now as this sort of big uber rich company, but of course, hopefully in the video I tried to explain that it wasn't that case at all. They had almost nothing. They were just running the whole company on a shoestring, and that's why they were trying to essentially do the thing they wanted to do, which was try and expand the range. They were trying to improve the car, and they didn't really have much money left over for things like redesigns. The redesign that Porsche did in 1969 really isn't clear who started the project. There's claims that in 1966 Porsche was working on it, and then 1968 things start happening over in VW. So I went with what VW says on their site, but maybe things were happening earlier on with conversations between VW and Porsche. I really don't know, but there's also maybe some revisionist history going on the VW website, or maybe they're missing something. I don't really know. Sometimes you just run out of facts, and you just have to sort of go with what you can find. There's also conflicting information about what happened with Kurt Lotz. So Kurt Lotz took over in the late 60s as VW CEO and was not popular. He manages to annoy all the unions, he managed to annoy Porsche, and so he's not very popular as far as VW history goes. So again, I think maybe there's conflicting information about who started the Porsche project and who started the project that became the Golf, and then who killed that project and then started the thing that became the Golf. And again, there's conflicting information about who did this. And again, maybe because they don't like Kurt Lotz, maybe they're trying to put him under the bus. I don't really know. I've tried to go with the best source that I could find on that one. Going back to that 1969 Porsche redesign, the engine under the rear seat may also have been to try and maximize the amount of space that you got in the car, because remember, the Beetle still had a boot up front that people could use, and of course with this 1969 redesign there were maybe also trying to play on the fact that with the VWs, they had this space up front. This car would also have space in the back, and so they would essentially have a lot of storage space for the car. So maybe that's was something that they were also thinking about. One thing I didn't mention in the video, but was kind of funny, is that obviously we had these Herbie films in the 60s and 70s, and they were rebooted, I think, in the 1990s, that Disney did. But West Germany had its own type of Herbie films. They didn't look particularly good or high quality, but anyway, they made some as well, and they weren't Herbie, they gave them a different name. So one thing VW really focused on, which I think really worked, was high quality dealerships. When they put a new dealership, for example, when they went into the US and they started putting dealerships in place, they made sure that they trained the staff so that they knew how to fix the cars, and that was all set up before the dealership went live. They also made sure they were stocked with enough spares, because when they started selling cars, if any driver had a problem when they brought the car in, they wanted to make sure they had a really good user experience. And this is the problem that, you know, other, particularly British car manufacturers and other car companies had a problem with. You know, they weren't giving the level of service which needed to be done, and VW really focused on that, and I think that was a critical strength that they had in those early days. They were also continually improving the car. The car in the 50s was better than the one in the 40s, the one in the 60s was better than the one in the 50s. They were constantly trying to work out how to make the car more reliable, longer lasting, all these small parts. They were slowly improving them, so every car was better every single year. And again, this was not something which other car companies were really doing. They were trying to make the car really bulletproof, so it may have looked old-fashioned and just really out of character with other cars at the time, but it was reliable and dependable, which is not something you can say about a lot of cars from the 1950s and 60s and even 70s. So as I said, VW was running their business on a shoestring, and they were focusing on quality, making sure dealerships were high quality, and only when they had some cash did they make sure that they could expand their range. And that's really what they were focusing on, expanding the range, because they had one car, eventually two with a Type 2, but really they didn't have much of a full range, and it was hard to compete against other larger car companies when you've got essentially one car. So having expanded range made a lot of sense. And because the Beetle kept selling, there was always less of an impetus to try and replace it. I mean, it would have been nice to have updated the Beetle, and of course, you know, in the 50s they tried just a simple restyle. Eventually they tried a full update of the Beetle in the later 50s and the 1960s. But again, it was a lower priority to try and expand their range and also make sure they had the expanded sales to different parts of the world. So I think VW really focused on the right things, but they were very lucky that the public latched onto the Beetle looks and just gave the car a much longer lifespan than it would have otherwise had. Obviously, you know, it lasted decades longer than other cars had. But clearly having a development department in-house earlier on would have been a better thing for them. They could have done more work to improve the chassis, or certainly the engine. They were really stifled with these air-cooled engines for so long. And not having their own department to be able to do some design, or even, of course, styling to do potential updates, they didn't have that, and that was a real problem. And of course, they then spent big in the 1960s buying NSU and Auto Union, and then the Type 3 and Type 4 were just complete failures. So there were definitely setbacks that they had. And it would take until the 1970s when they really started firing on all cylinders by having the Golf and the Passat and the Polo, and of course Audi then started doing really well. Another thing that they did really well, which is quite underrated, I think, is the fact that they did a great job on advertising, particularly in North America. Their marketing in the 50s and the 60s was very clever and got people really excited about the car. And you can look at the Volkswagen, the longevity they've had with their cars in North America. The Golf is still on sale in the US after, 1974 it was first put in. It's still for sale. But when General Motors tried to sell the Astra in the Vauxhall Opel Astra in North America as a Saturn. It wasn't a hit and was there for a few years and then just disappeared. Again, maybe the advertising that General Motors did wasn't as good as the advertising that Volkswagen did. Maybe it's something else, who knows. You see all these different prototypes which Volkswagen produced for the Beetle. They produced many, many different ones in the 50s and 60s, really trying to work out what they want to do. But remember that prototypes are relatively cheap to do. Actually producing a new car, particularly a new car that has a lot of new parts to it, is very expensive and can take several years. And of course it's even harder when you don't have your own development team. The Beetle also had this big long shadow. As time went on, it became harder and harder to try and replace it. So they really needed to have something that would sell in as great a number or even greater numbers, and the Beetle was already selling pretty well. So whatever had to replace it had to be pretty good. Well, that's about all I have to say, and you can see from the jump cuts I'm really not good at this sort of thing, but hopefully I got kind of my message across. So anyway, in general, VW did an excellent job turning this car that really wasn't very spacious into the Golf, which was really a very good spacious car and did a very good job. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next video.